Hi, everyone. Welcome to our AAPI Book Month Panel on world building in sci-fi and fantasy worlds. I am Akshaya Raman. I am the author of The Ivory Key, which is set to come out in 2021, and I am very excited to be here chatting with these incredible authors. So to begin with, I'll have everyone go around and introduce themselves. We will start with Swati.
Hey everyone, I'm Swati Teerdhala. I am the author of the Tiger Midnight series, which starts with The Tiger Midnight, and I actually have a copy here. For once, I'm prepared. And the second book is out in 2 weeks, The Archer at Dawn. So The Tiger Midnight starts out, it is a cat and mouse game between a soldier and the rebel who has been accused of murdering his general. And of course, things are not quite as they seem. And as they keep crossing paths, they begin to learn more about each other and more about the truths that actually lie behind all the secrets they've been told. In book 2, I don't want to spoil it, but it continues the story, and they end up going to the Sun Mela, which is this big, ancient, deadly tournament of warriors, and lots of things happen.
Great. Tara?
I am Tara Sim. I am the author, most recently, of Scavenge the Stars, which is the first in a YA fantasy duology that's kind of like a reimagining of the Count of Monte Cristo, where basically a girl stabs the men who have wronged her and her family. And I'm also the author of the Timekeeper trilogy, which is an alternate historical fantasy / steampunk queer romance thing.
Okay, Karuna?
Hi, I'm Karuna Riazi, and I'm the middle grade author of The Gauntlet. Let me see, it's on camera. And its companion, The Battle, which are both from Simon & Schuster Salam Reads. And I also wrote a middle grade adaptation of The Jungle Book for the Ghostwriter series from Sesame Workshop and Sourcebooks Wonderland. The Jungle Book is self-explanatory, but The Gauntlet is an inverse Jumanji with Middle Eastern and South Asian flair, starring 12-year-old Bangladeshi-American girl Farah Mirza, who has to plunge into a diabolical board game in order to save her younger brother Ahmed, who's been sucked into the game. And in The Battle, which is, as I said before, its companion, Ahmed has to face off against the game with his new friend Winnie, and it's now in a video game format and not just a board game.
Great. And Tanaz?
Hi, I'm Tanaz Bhathena, and I'm the author of 2 contemporary novels, A Girl Like That, The Beauty of the Moment, and my latest book is a young adult fantasy, Hunted by the Sky. Let me see if it's on camera. Yeah, here it is. And it's the first of a YA fantasy duology set in a world inspired by medieval India. The story follows a girl named Gul who's vowed vengeance against a tyrant king for ordering the murder of her parents. Trained in warrior magic by a group of rebel women, Gul infiltrates the king's palace with the help of a reluctant stable boy who has some dark secrets of his own.
Great. You are all very prepared with your books. Okay, so we'll just jump right into the world building stuff. So world building is obviously a very broad topic. So when it comes to creating a whole new world, where do you start? Is it a question, a place, a magic system, something else? And whoever wants to answer can just jump in.
Well, now I have a whole new world from Aladdin stuck in my head. I think for me, it definitely comes down to magic system first, because for me, the magic system is going to influence the society that I'm trying to build, and what the world looks like. So if it's an elemental magic, obviously the world is going to kind of reflect that, and what sorts of beasts and monsters are in it, or what does the military look like with elemental magic users and stuff like that. So I think for me, it's definitely or at least with high fantasy stuff, it boils down to magic system first and then kind of going out from there.
Yeah, for me, it sometimes stems from a question. I like to ask myself what if questions a lot. So, what if this happened? What if this were real? Or, what if that myth was actually, take it into real life, what would that end up looking like? And so I kind of build out worlds from one or two questions and then just kind of dive deeper into them. And sometimes the magic is involved, sometimes it's not. But, even if you're writing a contemporary, that kind of world building is essential too.
I feel like for me, like often my ideas come as like a little bit of a fragment. And then I'm just like, I think I kind of go with the what if questions too, where it's just like, okay, I have to ask questions why this fragment came to me and why it matters and what kind of world would this fragment fit into. Like, okay, so you have a brief flash of, let's say hypothetically, this girl standing in front of a fantasy train. And I'm sorry in advance that I'm going to say a lot of weird things right now because I've been teaching all day and talking way too much already. But like, let's say like there's a fantastical train, she's standing in front of it. Okay, like, halt, what makes that train fantastical, and like what does it look like, and what is the world around, what does the girl look like? And that kind of helps me kind of like take more steps into the world and figure out what's going on in there.
With me, especially with this particular book, I started with an existing place, India, or more specifically medieval India, and I had to think about how the kingdom of Amber in Hunted by the Sky would be similar to and different from a typical kingdom in 15th century Hindustan. I knew there would be magic, but then how would magic impact power and privilege in society? Would religion play as big a role as it does typically in the subcontinent? Would society be open to different types of love and relationships? If there was a patriarchy in place, then what was the reason for it? What was the history behind it? As we all know, India was colonized by the British, and colonization plays a huge role even in present-day India in terms of ideology, the way history is told, even the legal system. So while writing the book, I had to essentially decolonize my imagination to figure out what Amber would have looked like without that sort of foreign influence.
Yeah. I love that you all kind of approach it in like very different ways, like where you start. But I think those questions are very, very common as like a starting place. So kind of going off what you were saying, Tanaz, so a lot of like South Asian cultures, very often get like boiled down to just a handful of identities and a handful of stereotypes. But obviously there's a huge amount of diversity when it comes to like language and religion and culture, food. So how have like your own experiences and your upbringings shaped the world that you have built on a fundamental level?
So I belong to the Zoroastrian or the Parsi community. We are a minority faith who came to India as refugees from Persia, and we planted roots in Gujarat and Maharashtra. So for me, being Parsi has always meant an amalgamation of Indian and Persian cultures. And so while creating the world for Hunted by the Sky, I took inspiration from both Hindu and Zoroastrian mythology. So I read the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, but I also read the Shahnameh. I do not want my book to be a retelling of mythology per se, but I certainly used existing myths as a sort of base to create my own world stories and magical creatures.
Yeah, I really love that, Tanaz. I did something somewhat similar with my world building, which is I really pulled from a mixture of history, actually, and mythology, Hindu mythology. So the Tiger at Midnight series is based in ancient India. I kind of modeled it after the Mauryan Empire, that time period, with some inaccuracies, so don't at me. There's magic. But yeah, so combining the history and then the mythology and combining them to get a feel for the world I wanted, that was so crucial. And so much of that came just from the tales I was told growing up, or the version of the tales I heard. And a lot of them were really focused on these really honorable, dutiful warriors. And that is a huge kind of tentpole or pillar of the series and the world building in general. And in specific, I also, like with clothing choices and things, I tried to, the reason why I picked ancient India is not just because I'm obsessed with it, but there was a totally different version of India back then, from the clothing, from the food, the way religion was practiced, that you don't typically see in depictions of India nowadays, I would say. So a lot of what people think of as Indian culture is really North Indian culture. Whereas, I'm from South India. And so I grew up with different kinds of traditions, different kind of clothes I would wear. And so I tried to sprinkle it here and there wherever I could.
Yeah, I often see stuff with like the mainstream is like Hindu culture and religion, but my family is Punjabi and Sikh. So we don't really have that sort of like representation out there. Like the only thing I can really think of off the top of my head is like Bend It Like Beckham. It was like the first time I ever saw like a Sikh family, and I was like, what? That's like us. So when I write my fantasy novels, a lot of the times I will borrow a lot from Hindu culture and religion because of the mythology aspect. But when it comes to things like clothes and food, I borrow a lot from my own experience within Punjabi and Sikh culture. And a lot of times, like with religion too, the religion will look different, but always kind of like with my own spin on it, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think everything I write is pretty aggressively like Muslim characters at this point. That's kind of part of my brand. So obviously that's like, that's my religious background. So I pull a lot on that. In terms of like, I know that the Gauntlet is pretty much like loosely South Asian. Like that is one of my things about that book, where it's just like, if I could go back, like there was so much I was doing for the first time with that book. It was my first Muslim character. It was my first like brown character. Like, for the first time in years, like I finally faced down a lot of like the self-fear and self-rejection. And I was just like, okay, like, they want a brown character from you. You're going to give this like 100%. And I was encouraged to like pull on my background and my heritage, the Bangladeshi side of my heritage. But I feel like when I read The Gauntlet, I still see a lot of places where I went in a little bit. I put food from my Bangladeshi family. I put like inside references that my cousins read, and they're just like, oh yeah, we totally do that. Like we totally used to play like Ghost, which is a game that Farah and her cousins play, which I'm not even sure if that's actually like a Bangladeshi game, or if it's like a Bangladeshi our family game to like freak each other out and pretend to be a ghost in the room in the middle of the night. But like, then I would kind of pull back and just put something that like, I guess people would assume was generally South Asian. And I think with the battle and with every other idea I'm working on after that, I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm just like, okay, how much more specifically can I put from my family in particular, and what we do, and like, what our particular area of Bangladesh is known for, like what kind of traditions we've had, and work around, like, work those into my story. So I think for me, it's kind of like I'm still getting to that point where some parts I'm just like, okay, let's go. Like, this is totally in this book. And there are other parts where it's just like slowly but surely, like getting to that point where it's going to be obviously inspired and like very directly there.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really like about The Gauntlet was like how it sort of started in our world, and then you like go to this other world. And I actually kind of want to talk about that in like a little bit broader sense, whether it's like having like more tropes, or like, in the case of like Scavenge, it being a retelling. So how do you go about like writing stories when it comes to diaspora communities, like weaving together these like more traditional cultural details and like your own experiences with some of these Western elements?
Yeah, kind of like, since you brought up Scavenge, with my main character, Amaya specifically, if I were to like translate her ethnicity into like a real world situation, she would be half Indian, half Chinese. And her father was Indian, but they don't live within the country that he's from. So she only relies on like his stories and like what he talks about in his culture, which obviously is what I grew up with in America, with my mom telling me stories and like, oh, this is what it was like when I was growing up, or like, this is what I ate, this is how I dressed, that kind of stuff. In a more like literal sense, when I was writing Chainbreaker, which is the second book in the Timekeeper series, it was my first time actually writing about India and writing Indian characters, because I had been scared to before. Like I had that like barrier of like, oh, well, I'm not like Indian enough, or like I just like can't do it for some reason. And like I grew up reading fantasy books full of like white characters, so that was what I ended up writing at first. So when I got to Chainbreaker and started writing it, one of my characters, Daphne, is white passing and biracial like me. So having her kind of like come from both the British and Indian side, like during this time period where India was colonized by the British, it was an intensely like personal thing for me, because even though obviously my experience and Daphne's experiences are going to be completely different, I put so much of things that I had personally experienced into her experiences. So it was like almost like a direct translation into that character. So that was a little scary, but I think it definitely paid off, especially when readers would like come up to me and be like, even though I'm like, some of them would be biracial and some of them would just be like fully Indian, but Indian American. And they would be like, even though I'm not biracial, I still felt really seen through Daphne's POV. And so that really touched me. And it told me that I had done the right thing in doing that, basically.
Yeah, Swati, do you want to talk about the book?
The way I kind of tried to meld, I would say that being Indian and being American, being Indian American experience is really just the way that I crafted the fantasy elements more than anything. So the world is based off of ancient India, but at the same time, the magic in a lot of ways is directly pulled from the fantasy books, the Western fantasy books I read. There's hints of kind of just melding them together, like the one of the basis kind of, I would say one of the myths that is the basis for the magic system, without too many spoilers, is based off of the myth of Gunga, for example. However, at the same time, the fact that there is like a magic system that has certain elements to it and is structured in a certain way and has certain tropes is very, very much pulls from my experience growing up in a Western fantasy tradition. So it was like kind of interesting. I think on some level, I didn't really think about it. And then later, as I started to revise, I realized I had to think about it and I had to really build out this world properly. And that's when I started to notice where I was pulling in things from different parts of my identity or my background. So I mentioned I'm South Indian. Specifically, I'm Telugu, which means my family's from the state of Andhra Pradesh. So there's little things like even in the way that culture was represented. So for example, one of the beginning scenes of The Tiger at Midnight, Isha's not wearing toe rings, which means that she's single. She's not married. So that's a very Telugu, very South Indian thing that I wove in just because I wanted to see it in a story that was fantasy and had all these other things I loved, but also I could tell that story and make it more my own. So it was somewhat unconscious and somewhat kind of done on purpose later on. But yeah, it was a weird mix.
I think that one of the things that really helped me in terms of, like grounding the story and making sure those cultural elements were there alongside the Western elements was like the food and like the family dynamics. I come from a family that my Bangladeshi side, I have, we're 31st cousins all together, like, because my grandmother had 10 sons and one daughter. So like we are a huge family. So I feel like that family dynamic of like, having these family get-togethers, the way that her mom is cooking in the beginning of the game, and like even in the sequel with Ahmed, like, you get that whole background where it's like there's constantly like, cooking going on, and board games are really a huge thing, not just like in my Bangladeshi family, but in a lot of Bangladeshi families. That's how you connect. And in my family, that's how you keep the younger cousins from killing each other. So like, those were the sort of things where it kind of looked like maybe at first people would be like, well, that's not actually a South Asian thing for you to put in to your book. But like, people have come up to me and they have said like, okay, I totally get this. Or like, even just you mentioning this sweet, like we eat that sweet. So that was so cool. So like it kind of, it kind of was nice just putting those little things in that people could look at and say, well, like, yeah, this feels like a small thing, but it is like something from this daily life and this daily experience that I can relate to and connect with.
for me, I like Swati as well. I also started off with a magical system that was sort of inspired by the kind of Western stories that I would read. I mean, a lot of people have mentioned that Hunted by the Sky has very chosen one themes, and that is true. But at the same time, I kind of juxtapose that with a lot of Indian mythology. So the concept of meddling gods, or gods coming down on earth as avatars and things like that. So I was kind of playing on both of these elements and kind of trying to put them together as much as I could. Because at the end of the day, what I wanted to do was that I wanted the book to be as accessible as possible, but at the same time incorporate all the things that I personally loved when I was growing up, when I was watching all these amazing mythology shows like Ramayana or Mahabharata. And I kind of wanted to put that into my books as well.
Yeah, I love that several of you talked about food. So we're going a little off script here, but can you talk a little bit about like how you use food as like a way to like connect to your culture in this? I know Tara has a lot of feelings about this, so
I do have a lot of feelings about it. Yeah, I'm one of those people who now if I read books that just have the characters being like they bread and cheese and that's it, I'm like, no. Describe. So like as I mentioned before, I grew up reading all of these like big fantasy books by white authors that had a bunch of white characters in it. And so when I started writing books, that was kind of like what I naturally began writing at first. And so the food descriptions were all just kind of bland. And I was like, I don't like writing food scenes because I don't know, like, I don't know, I don't care. And then as I got older and started writing with more like, South Asian inspired characters, I started writing more like Indian food into my stories. And suddenly the words just like flew out of me. And I was like, oh, okay, well, this is apparently what I've been missing. I love writing about food in books now, especially Indian food. I think I mentioned before that like a lot of the food of like Northern India will like find its way into my books because that's what I grew up with and it's what I find comfort in.
First of all, I just want Tara to like give a keynote on the importance of food in fantasy and like diverse food because that was beautiful.
I'm gonna call it Beyond Bread and Cheese.
Yeah, second of all, I feel so much of what you feel. Like I remember one of the most iconic articles I've ever read in my writing career as a teenager was when Cindy Pond wrote this article about the importance of writing food in Asian fantasy. And it was just like, it was beautiful and it was perfect. And it just made me realize how much of our culture and our family connections are through food. And that's why I'm like really super, like, if you read anything that I write, even like my current work in progress, Nafisa and Kat can tell you that there's like a whole page scene about cooking chicken curry that might have to come out at some point, but right now is staying. But I was just thinking, like the way Tara was saying, like, they're always eating bread and cheese. One of my best friends used to live in Queens when I was in middle school, and that's part of why Farah used to live in Queens, because that was my experience, like huge Bangladeshi community in Queens. And I remember we went to the aquarium once on Coney Island, and her mom packed like this lunch, and we were like, what's in it? Like, it's so heavy. And like she was making the kids carry it. She's like, don't worry about it. Then it's like lunchtime. She's like, we're not going to the cafeteria. And she just like takes out tons of food. She had paratha, she had omelet, she had like 2 different kinds of meat in there. And like other families were looking at us and they're probably just like, wow,
they wanted your food.
Our bread and cheese looks
they were
very
jealous.
lacking right now. But like, when I think about that type of journey food, like, maybe some authors would be like, bread and cheese it doesn't spoil so easily, and omelet was spoiled. Well, whatever. We have other foods that would make more sense. You can
ferment things. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm very passionate
like
about this.
exactly. But like the point is that like there's so much cooler foods and like so much like different ways of bringing that food along with you that we don't need your colonized bread and cheese.
That's so true because
I love that. I mean, that was just like
it's very interesting that you say that, because like that's also a lot of my childhood memories. Like whenever we'd go on like road trips, like we always like packed like whole like boxes of rice, and we would just like take all of this stuff And that's how we like did anything. Like we never took like any Western food. It was always just like very traditional South Indian Tamil food. So yes, I do like skiing.
Like my mom will not let me go through an airport, go on a train. She does not want me buying any food ever. Like if we go, I think my parents went to Paris and they found an Indian restaurant in Paris and spent most of their time there. Like, I mean, you gotta do you.
I remember when I was in college, my mom experimented by sending me parathas through the mail. And like they were fine. But like, I just remember like going up to my white friends and being like, "This is a paratha," and they're like, "What?"
Okay, well, transitioning a little bit out of food, I want to talk about the kinds of stories that you write. So I know you all write in different age categories, like middle grade and YA, or adult. Or transitioning from like contemporary to fantasy or the other way. Can you talk a little bit about how your process has changed as you switch genres or age categories? Tanaz, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so my first two books were contemporary, and both were set in places that I had personally lived in for over 10 years, Saudi Arabia and Canada. Medieval India was different. The landscape was honestly based off TV shows initially, like Bharatvarsh and Akbar Birbal, and obviously later on I had to do some actual research, and I had to start reading historical documents like Ain-e-Akbari and nonfiction by writers like William Dalrymple and Ira Mukhoti. I think the fantasy aspect of my world building made it both challenging and fun. For example, the magical system was tough to figure out initially, but there was also a lot of flexibility to stretch my imagination, which realistic fiction doesn't really allow. So, for example, if a famous monument exists in a city, you can't get rid of it without explaining what happened, which would take you into the realm of dystopian and not realistic fiction, really.
I'd say like the difference between writing YA and excuse me, and writing adult is especially when it comes to world building, is that like my biggest takeaway from it is that in YA it seems that the characters influence the world more versus adult the characters are shaped by the world more, if that makes sense. So my approaches they're largely the same, but they're slightly different in terms of like how far I can like expand things. Because obviously like an adult, you have more of a word count and you have more time to kind of have like a slower pace and like really develop things more. Versus in YA, it's just kind of like, let's keep going. We can't get off this track. We're on this train to the very end.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I moved mainly from middle grade to YA. So I just have one very clear recollection from when I was writing The Gauntlet, and I'd written this whole like vibrant scene about this palace door, and my editor's notes was, "Gosh, this is beautiful, but this is way too long for middle grade." And she literally was like, "You need to take off the YA hat for now." And I was just like, wow, like, you know, it was really like kind of eye opener for me because it was my first time writing middle grade. There's like they're kind of like the way Tara was saying, there's kind of like tiers of world building where like depending on the age you have to kind of hold it a little back, I think. Not like saying like, oh, middle grade is lacking in world building compared to YA, or YA is lacking in world building compared to adult. But I feel like there's like this different ground and this different awareness where you have to know how much you can give. And when I get into YA, then I get really like, I kind of go really wild and I'm just like, okay, I'm back into like a certain page limit. So now I can describe. And then it's just like, wait, no, you have to restrain yourself. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that I always struggle with because as you can see, I ramble too much. So that's always my struggle when it comes to world building, just remembering which category I'm in and how many words I have to describe a door.
Love that. I kind of following that, I would say the biggest thing I've learned for world building and my process is for fantasy in general, I want to dive into the world as much as possible, as much as I need to understand the story, regardless of the category. It's how much you reveal through the actual writing. That's definitely something I've been struggling with and have struggled with. But, you know, I would say that's the biggest thing. What's been more interesting is I've also been trying my hand at contemporary, and not even like contemporary fantasy, like true contemporary, which has been a thing. And it's really fun. And I love it because it's world building in a totally different way. You're focused more on memories, and you can go deeper into how someone lives their life and really recreating that. So thinking about even like a movie set. So that's been really fun and exciting. I don't quite have a process yet, but it's been different.
And kind of in that vein, how do you approach expanding your world when it comes to, you know, writing a sequel or a companion novel, which I know you have all done or in the process of doing? Why don't we start with Karuna?
Okay, so for me, like the complication was that there wasn't an original sequel or companion planned. It was kind of just like, oh, this book went really well, so would you consider doing a companion? And I was kind of just like, okay. Then it was like, oh shoot, were there any loopholes left in that? And it turned out like, you know, it felt like kind of like when you knit something and then you're just like, wait, the stitches had to be looser, so you're kind of just going to find that loophole. But the good thing was there were still some unanswered questions. Paheli as a game world is pretty rich and dark and mysterious, and there were so many things that were left to explore, and about how the game functions on the inside, about how, like, you know, these beautiful palaces are like hanging up in the air, and like, you know, all this mysterious sand and what's hidden underneath it. There was a lot to kind of dig into and expand out, and it was a lesson for me in how this industry can change things. So even if as a standalone, you should be leaving yourself a little room. And it was kind of great in a way that I love world building, and the world had ended up being so like expansive. So there was space for me to, like, you know, kind of work my way back in there, because otherwise I would have been in a lot of trouble. And it was still kind of difficult to go back in and say, okay, there needs to be a companion now. How is this going to like translate over? And I think what also helped was the fact that the board game format changed to a video game. So then it was like, okay, let's think about video game levels. And that gave it a new like area of development where I had to, like, you know, think and, you know, try to picture how that would look.
I had the opposite problem as Karuna. I had a 3-book series in mind initially, but then it sold as a duology. So I had to suddenly narrow down everything drastically. And in a way, though, I'm glad I narrowed things down, because when I actually started writing, the sequel got incredibly detailed. There were so many magical elements that I had to explain or use effectively. And plot-wise, I did not really feel the need to expand beyond 2 books for this particular story. One of the biggest challenges that I faced writing the sequel was that I had to write a lot of war scenes, and I had to do a lot of research for that. The research part was really a lot of fun, and also incorporating all the magical elements in. But I did not anticipate how emotionally exhausting it is to write a war scene. I'm doing line edits for this book right now, and every time I reread a section, I just feel the impact, and I'm like, oh my God, why did I write this book?
I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah. Similarly, I like leaving enough room for reveals. So kind of like staggering what I reveal in each book. My big method when it comes to series is that by the time that you get to the last book, the worst possible thing that could happen to the characters happens, or the worst thing that could happen in this world happens. So for example, in the Timekeeper trilogy, the first book is mostly just focused on like a small town in England. And then by book 2, it expands out to the entire subcontinent of India. And then by book 3, it's like basically the whole world. So in terms of that, my process a lot of the times is for my characters to travel a lot in the sequels, because then you get to see more of the world that's introduced in book one?
Yeah, I did something somewhat similar. Is the first book is kind of just a window into this much larger world. And with each book, I really just tried to focus on deepening not just the existing characters' backstories and their interactions with the world, but also making sure that every new character that was introduced had a really clear tie into that world that felt authentic and helped to illuminate a new corner of the world, if possible. So really focusing on expansion as much as possible, and expansion through character, really. So of course, like I wrote tomes of information about various different things, or the copper production in this one region, but that's not going to make its way into the book. It just informed my idea of how that world became a world that these characters lived in. It was also fun to just kind of explore more, and so I left myself some room for discovery, which I think is really crucial to keep that kind of spark of inspiration alive.
Yeah, I love that. So before we open it up to questions from the audience, do you have books by South Asian authors that you feel like have particularly great world building that you want to recommend?
Emperor in the Ashes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about why?
No. I still remember reading the first book way back when and just being like, dang, like this is so detailed and like intricate. And I love the way that she just like intersects everything together. And kind of like what I was saying before, where it's like you start off in like this one place and then the characters travel and you expand and you get to like learn about all these different other subsections of the world. And I just really, I like how she does it in the series.
I would say Empire of Sand by Tasha Suri. It's a standalone, but it's incredibly beautiful. The magic and the world are so intricately tied together. It's just a masterpiece, really.
I was about to say Empire of Sand too. I really love that book. It's so great the way she incorporates the Mughal world and she makes it her own completely. And I also love Sukanya Venkatraghavan's Dark Things. It's a completely different world with yakshas and yakshis and all sorts of fantastical creatures. It's absolutely fantastic. Also, I love Shweta Thakrar's Star Daughter, which is full of celestial courts and it's really brimming with magic and starlight, and it's beautiful.
I was literally about to say Star Daughter because I've had the pleasure of reading a few drafts of that, and it's just so beautiful and so luminous. I would also say The Candle in the Flame by Nafisa Azad, who I mentioned before. I always feel like when I think about writing fantasy, I'm always like, I'm going to write a world that feels just like Nafisa's, because you can tell how much time she takes to make that world feel like incredible and big and all around you and like so immersive. So those are two that I would definitely say as well.
Okay, great. So do we have any questions from our audience? Okay. How do you know the balance of when to stop world building and start writing the story? I know one of the things I struggle with is having so much world building that I don't start the story. That is a great question. Whoever feels like they want to jump in can just go ahead.
I would say this is sometimes a problem for me because I'm a history buff at heart. I can read a book and then start thinking of 10,000 new ideas or ways I want to expand or deepen the world. And so I try and keep a document that allows me to run wild with my imagination and write, long backstories for random side characters. But I really, as I kind of mentioned before, try and stick to this lens of why would this be important to the character and the story that I'm currently telling. And I try not to be someone who goes too in deep with world building before I start writing. I like to do it in tandem because I have a tendency to get really deep in the weeds. And so by doing it in tandem, I'm writing the story and I can see what I need versus what I can put aside and just do for fun.
Yeah, a lot of the times I will go in with just like a broad sense of what the world is like and what the story is like, because a lot of the times for me, I'm like half plotter and half pantser. So as I go in, I'll just literally discover things as I draft. And some things I'll be like, what? That's such a great idea. Why didn't I come up with this in the first place? But it's just how my brain works, apparently. It's like I need time to really like either understand the characters or understand one facet of the world before I can move on to the next one. So it really helps to only have like the broad outline of something as I start it.
I'm not very helpful for this because recently I found that the best way I world build is to like try to make myself write the story through and then realize, oh shoot, all of this is in my head, so I have to make sure you guys can see it in your head. So I kind of have the opposite problem where it's just like stop keeping it all to yourself and start putting more of it out there, at least with the stuff that I'm recently working on.
My process is to just put everything out there and then cut it down later on. I think I struggled with the same thing. My editors were like, there's too much world building in here, cut it down. And that's what I had to do. I had to like trim and simplify. Once I started doing that, I was able to see the plot more clearly. Oh, okay, this is what's happening here now that I have all the trimmings removed.
Okay. Do we have another question?
We had briefly.
Okay. Regarding the last decade of books, what hopes or issues would you want to see addressed or evolve in Desi-inspired world building for this decade?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer quite yet.
I think my answer is kind of what we touched on at the very beginning, which is that it's such a huge country that there are so many different cultures and languages and states and types of food and stuff like that. And I feel like a lot of the times we only have room to show like one of those in a book, especially if you're writing something like YA or middle grade, where you just have to kind of like level stuff down a little bit. But I would like to see more, especially in like adult fantasy or something, where you can like really expand out and touch on a few of them rather than just one.
Yeah, I would agree. Speaking of hopes, really, is letting go of this idea that there's a monolith. I 100% agree with that. We need more stories that represent all the different points of view that exist within the South Asian community. I mean, look at our panel. We're all entirely different, right? But we're all South Asian. So I really hope that is something that continues to improve, and we get to see more of that. So totally agree with that.
I agree with what both of you have said. I think that especially in India, there is really a saturation of mythology-inspired retellings, and I'd like to see a little bit of play with the sort of world building that we're seeing. Let the authors do their own thing, like a Game of Thrones kind of Desi version, or something Harry Potter inspired, or something completely different, with elements of all the Desi stuff that we know and love, with different states involved and things like that, instead of just, the certain like North India or, the things like that. So I think that's what I'm looking forward to seeing.
I feel like my hope is that more marginalized areas of South Asia will start feeling more confident in telling their stories. I'm already really it's been such an honor for me to be able to be reached out to Bangladeshi authors and say that, you were the first Bangladeshi representation I read in Kidlit. So because of you, I'm writing, or because of you, I felt encouraged. Yesterday we had the Henna Wars come out. That's a Bangladeshi author. We have Counting Down with You coming out in 2021. It's pretty cool to see that there are going to be more Bangladeshi voices coming out there. And I want not only Bangladeshi authors to feel more confident and say we're here and we're telling our stories, but other areas of South Asia in general, even different states or different areas of India, like you guys are saying. I really hope that people are looking at the books that are coming out and saying, maybe my area, my state, my region is not represented, and maybe I need to get out there and I'll write a story that someone's going to see themselves in because they need it just as much as I do. So that's really my big hope right now, that I'm seeing come, is coming to fruition, and it's hopefully going to keep like developing.
Yeah, absolutely. And like more diaspora communities, I think, would also be something that I would hope to see. Okay, so when world building, how do you determine when to stop worrying about possible historical inaccuracies? This is a great question. If
I can jump in here because I once spent an hour researching one tree, not even like a variety of trees. It was one tree for one paragraph. And because I was so worried, like I was going to get this wrong and someone was going to say, you know, you don't know anything. What are you talking about? Your entire like book and fantasy world are just totally wrong. And that would have been devastating. So I totally get where this question comes from. I think it's just a matter of realizing that there will always be inaccuracies because there is no way that anyone, unless you're literally writing a history book that is nonfiction at that point, can cover every little detail. And the whole idea of writing fantasy, which, you know, in this case, I'm assuming this, you know, you'll be writing fantasy, is to be able to take something and make it your own. I mean, magic doesn't exist, right? I mean, hopefully one day that might change. But right now, it's not something that's real, right? So why does every little detail have to be perfect? Even in our lived experience, like me living in New York, or Akshaya, you're in California, that experience is so different. So just kind of trusting that you're putting as much as possible into it, and then taking that leap of faith.
Mm. Yeah, especially in fantasy, because like I have read like Desi inspired fantasies from white authors where I'm like, I can definitely tell you're white, like because it's just a matter of like the details and like feeling so like foreign and weird, versus like reading actual fantasy novels from actual Desi authors where it feels so much more authentic. And I think that authenticity is way more important than the nitty-gritty historical accurate details. Because like I don't care when mango season is, like just tell the story and like speak to your authentic experience and what you know.
I think
I agree.
Sorry. This always happens with me. I'm so sorry. But I was going to say that I think that as a writer, particularly from like a background of being in a diaspora, you have to get ready for like people to just like, be harder on you amazingly from within your community than they are going to be from someone writing outside of that community. It's a sad truth. And so like, I feel bad in advance to say this, but there will be times where people will make you feel bad over something that other people will say, you know what? Didn't even notice that. Wasn't even a big deal. It was okay. That, that if it was an outsider writing it, it might not have been that scrutinized. It would have been like they tried their best. So that's the sad reality. And I think at the end of the day, you're just going to have to also tell yourself that I did my absolute best. And like, there's some stuff like, like mango season, like no one is really going to care. It's not going to matter to anyone except for you. So like, there are some things that you're just going to have to say, I did my best. If someone doesn't like it, I know I did my best, and I did my hardest to kind of like, represent my community and my history. And that's all I can do. Like, I'm not a superhuman here who knows every single thing that happened in history at every given time. I did my research. Probably you did even more research than someone coming from an external perspective. And that's what you're going to have to like, accept and forgive yourself, honestly.
What I wanted to just say is that if you're writing fantasy, it's not the same as historical fiction or historical nonfiction. So give yourself some room to play around instead of really worrying about the nitty-gritty accuracies and inaccuracies. Your world should make sense within the rules that you have set for it. So if mango season is going to happen in winter, it happens in winter, because that's what you're doing. It's fantasy. You're going to play around with it, right? If your monsoon is not happening in the subcontinent, sorry, it's not happening. This is my world. Maybe something happened that caused it to get eliminated. And you have to explain that. As long as you can explain that within the parameters of your world, I think you're allowed to do that in fantasy. Historical fiction, different story. Then you have to like kind of explain why you change things around and stuff like that.
Okay. Is your experience of reading Desi writers different than non-Desi writers? Tara, you spoke about this a little bit.
I already answered this.
But if like anyone else wants to talk about like your experience of this.
To answer the question very simply, yes. I think, and I'm not trying to be rude or disparaging at all, but there is a difference of having lived an experience that you can tell with really, really little things. I think people get really caught up, I think, in world building and these ideas of like the food needs to be correct or this like little detail, but it's more sometimes the feeling of the story also. So the themes that you're talking about, different cultures have different kind of themes if you think about it, what's important to them, what resonates within the community, what makes a community a community. And sometimes I think the moments where I feel a lot of that, I can notice the difference is when the details might be there, but those themes, those like deeper connections to what makes your community or your culture what it is, are lacking or they're not quite there. There's a lot of different examples, but I think that's kind of the broad way I'd sum it up.
Yeah, and I think, it's that authenticity that Tara was talking about. Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay, how do you balance giving world building details in the opening chapters without info dumping? Please, I need to know the answer to this question, so please tell me.
Me too.
Start with an action scene. Give the details in the forthcoming chapters. I think that's the best way to do it. That's what I've been told.
Yeah, I like to open up my books with like something really like interesting, whether it's an action scene or something where I like usually within like the very first sentence, I want the reader to be like, wait, what? And to just kind of like get sucked in. And they're just so interested in either the characterization going on or the action going on that they won't really have, or like they're okay with not having their questions answered until like the next chapter and all the chapters that come after it. Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, I personally don't think info dumping is particularly bad, but it's about like how you do it and in the context at which you do it.
Yeah, like I literally have on something I'm working on, I had to rewrite a first chapter and it ended up being so info dumpy that I just completely scrapped it again and had to write in a completely different direction. So I think like some info dumping is totally okay because especially in fantasy, you need to explain things and some things can't wait for you to get to like chapter 2. Some things you have to be like, I have to explain it to the reader now or else they're not going to understand the context of what's going on. But yeah.
So I
think it does also help.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say sometimes it helps to write that info dumpy chapter so that for yourself, okay, these are all the things that I need to communicate in chapter 1, but I can't just have 3 pages of world building. Now I need to break it apart and put it into a way that feels more digestible.
I was going to add that I have a slightly controversial opinion. I actually think exposition in a first chapter, and I'm going to clarify why I say exposition and not an info dump, is really important. And I actually like it. I like to be centered and grounded in a world before I'm taken on an adventure. I definitely think there's room to kind of be pushed into a world. But a lot of these, if you're writing a world that is like higher fantasy, it's a second world fantasy, maybe it has a hard magic system. And by hard magic system, I mean magic with a lot of rules and limits. I want to know what I'm getting myself into. I think the problem comes, and I think this is the case with most kind of writing tips, is when it's overdone or done in a bad way, right? So like you mentioned, you don't need 3 pages of it, a paragraph, 3 paragraphs woven into that first chapter can be really artfully done and can really make a reader feel like they're being supported on their journey with you.
I agree. And I think that's true even with like, you know, magic systems, like you said. It's just sometimes helpful to just know upfront, okay, this is how it works. So then you can focus on like the more fun things. Mm. Okay, so this is going to be our last question. Recommend a book with really good food scenes. Okay, I'm really excited about this.
Gotta think about that.
Ooh, The Wrath and the Dawn.
Yes, I was about to say Wrath and the Dawn.
Like, it's making me hungry thinking about it right now.
Like, literally, I think about that scene where she like makes the tea with like the little like crystallized like sugar like all the time. I don't know why. I just think about it all the time. Also, Labyrinth Lost had a really great food chapter.
Usually I have a bunch of titles and now my mind has entirely gone blank. I'm sorry, guys.
I know, I always write like every single book I've read.
I'm probably like super cheating, but I just keep thinking of Hungry Hearts, like, you know, the YA anthology. And I'm just like, well, that was full of really good food scenes. It was an anthology about food. So I guess that's my official contribution right now.
That works.
Yep.
Okay, great. So I think that is a good place to wrap things up. As a reminder, you can go to Asian Author Alliance to learn more about like the other panels that are happening this month, as well as about the panelist books. If you want to just, you know, right before we say bye, like, you know, hold up your book again and briefly mention if you have an upcoming release, when it's coming out, and then we can wrap up. Okay, all right, Swati, I know you have a book coming out soon, so why don't you start?
So the first book in the Tiger at Midnight series just came out in paperback, and then book 2 is coming out in 2 weeks on May 26th.
Yay.
Yeah, Scavenge the Stars came out in January, and the sequel comes out in March of next year.
Hunted by the Sky comes out on June 23rd of this year, and its sequel will come out next year, 2021.
And I'm not currently under contract. So
but you do have some amazing books.
Yeah, so I'll just show you my books again. So The Gauntlet, The Battle, which came out last summer, and the retelling of The Jungle Book, which, fun fact, if you Google The Jungle Book, it comes up that I'm the author of The Jungle Book, which probably has Kipling rolling over in his little racist grave. So
I love that. I love that.
So that came out last December.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for joining us.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.